It's good to be here as a part of the 250th 50-year celebration of white settlement of this territory. There had been Native Americans here some years before that, but not at that particular time when we came. But it's an important celebration and one that hopefully will create some interest in where we have been over the years. As I look around, I see people that I have not met. I see people that I've known for a long time, and some others that I think are pretty much native to Scott County. I am not. I came to Scott County about 65 years ago to go to college. Left briefly, but ended up coming back and couldn't get out ever since. That didn't have anything to do with Scott County. But tonight I'm talking about the economic history of the county and how it developed over the years, the various stages of it. I would be remiss not to inform you that I am not an economist. I am a historian by training. And that's a little different. I can see what was and sometimes what is, but not what it will become. That remains in the cards to be played, I suspect. But it is an important topic because it says a lot about us and how we developed. For new people, it will tell you something about who we have been over the years and how fast we're developing from that point. For older people, I suspect that have been here a lot longer, it's a bit of nostalgia. I see the painting of the Elkhorn Creek there, and spent many a day fishing that creek and enjoying every minute of it. The title of this presentation I owe to Julia Taylor. She's the one who suggested it. From Hemp to Hybrids, Scott County Economic History. It's catchy. But it also gives you an idea of our historical path through the last 250 years. From agriculture and industry to now the economy is predominantly industrial through those years. For a few minutes, I want to talk with you about what we were and how and why we became what we are. One of the first things I want to note, however, is that we were never the little isolated town we thought we were. We have always been involved from the very beginning on the international stage. England and France fought each other and us for the control of the lush Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Economic interests joined power motives. The French and the English, if you remember your older history, loved to fight each other and did so for hundreds of years, I suspect. But they fought here over this land. And it was as much economic, I suspect, as it was political or power politics, if you will. They saw the value of it. The beaver pelt trade for years just remade European fashion for a time. But even the land itself, they saw the value of it, the fertility of it, and figured it could be used to good profit as the years went on. They often used Native Americans in their efforts to kick us out. Sometimes we actually fought with them, but not often. The Indians didn't want us here either. They wanted the land, they wanted to keep it a hunting ground, obviously, and I suspect most of you know that. Even as late as the War of 1812, we fought the British at the Battle of the Thames, as well as Tecumseh and his Shawnee warriors. Scott County and Richard Mentor Johnson, later a vice president of the United States, was a hero of the battle. whether he shot Tecumseh or not. I've always maintained, you lead a force of 20 men into a battle with Native Americans that you can't see, you are a fool or a hero or both. And I think he deserves the credit maybe for being both, if you come right down to it. His role, he led a mission called the Mission of the Forlorn Hope. 20 men riding into a forested area, trying to find out, to literally draw fire from the Native Americans so that they'd know where they were. And then the main force, led by James Johnson, his brother, could go on and attack without being caught in an ambush. Of the 20 men, 15 died in the first volley of fire. Richard Mentor Johnson was struck by 5 different bullets. It took him over a year to recover, and he walked with a limp from that time until his death. Now, you can call it foolhardy, but it was successful. And we defeated the Native Americans and the British in that battle. I'm going to talk about agriculture first, because it was the dominant part of our economy. Most of the industries that we had well up into the 20th century were related to agriculture. And I'll talk about a little of that as we get into it. But we did not become predominantly industrial, or in other words, most of our economy did not come out of industry until around 2015 or 2016. And as you can figure, there's one industry that had a whole lot to do with that. And I suspect we all know which one that is. But first, I want to talk about agriculture. Hemp wasn't our first major product. That was corn. And we turned it into whiskey, Kentucky bourbon. What we didn't drink ourselves, and that was a lot, we shipped down the river system to New Orleans and out to the Western world. We shipped it there because the trip back across the Alleghenies was virtually impossible with that kind of product. But also because the Spanish, recognizing a little economic value to this area themselves, saw a good reason to be nice to us and let us use the port of New Orleans to get our whiskey out to the world. That almost meant for a while, and there are a lot of these things that we forget in our history books. There's a limit to what you can teach a class, by the way, but we take a lot of stuff out of the story, and as a result, we tend to forget it if we're not careful. But what that meant, using the port of New Orleans under Spanish control, was that we came very close to speaking Spanish rather than English. We don't like to talk about that. That's unpatriotic. Well, patriotism sometimes gives way to economics when you come right down to it. The importance of that export route led to plots by General James Wilkinson, Aaron Burr, and others to detach us from the fledgling republic and add us to the Spanish Empire. And there were a lot of Kentuckians who supported the move for economic reasons. Now, I hate to admit this, since I've spent most of my career writing about Henry Clay and his family, but Henry Clay was one of them that was suspected of sort of maybe possibly going along with this effort to become Spanish. As you know, we've continued to sell corn in the form of bourbon ever since. Baptist preachers, none of them British, prohibitionists, and a prominent advocate of tariffs have made it difficult, but the distillers just keep on trying. Hemp was our second largest cash crop. Let me say quickly here that hemp is not marijuana. It's in the same family, but it doesn't have the same kick that marijuana has. Years ago, when I was the dean of students at Georgetown College, I got a call one day from a maintenance man who told me that there was a certain fraternity on the campus that was drying marijuana on the roof. I won't mention which, we got a couple back here, but I won't mention which one it was. It wasn't the other one. Well, I went down, got on a ladder and climbed up through the house into the roof, and there it was laying on the thing. And I looked at it, and then I looked at it again, and I really thought the best punishment might be to let them smoke it. They were a couple of crackers from Ohio, a present company, diluted, and they didn't realize that it was horseweed. That would have been one of the best punishments I think I could have laid out for trying. The intent was there, but it was not cannabis, if you will. In fact, that would have made a nice topic from cannabis to Camrys. Oh, didn't think of that. But I didn't either until too late. Hemp was turned into a variety of products, and here you get the first combination of industry with agriculture. It was used, for example, to make rope. That's what most people know. Well, you had to have rope walks to put this together, and there were a number of rope walks through this area. Our very energetically industrial Baptist preacher, so-called founder of Georgetown College, Elijah Craig, who has a bourbon whiskey named after him, by the way, had a rope walk. And, along with a number of other industries. But they were industries that were attached to the agrarian base that we had here in the county. We also produced for the southern trade cotton bagging. They wrapped these huge big bales of cotton in a bagging, and it was made from hemp fibers. Navies throughout the world and commercial vessels at that time used an awful lot of rope. And the cotton industry did not stop growing. And so you had plenty of potential markets for that hemp, those hemp products in that particular day. Hemp continued to be the major crop into the 1880s, and it made periodic comebacks after that, particularly related to the two world wars. They needed the hemp, they needed rope, even in World War II. And so we went back into the hemp industry, at least for a while. I suspect that's what you could find in the fence rows of Scott County farms as late as the 1970s. Hemp production, and I haven't been aware of this for this long, but hemp production depended a lot on slavery. And some scholars have suggested that Kentucky probably would not have embraced slavery had it not been for hemp. But a free man, white or black, had to be awfully hungry to work in hemp. It was a horrible product to try to work in. There were two processes. Dew rotting of the hemp was the easiest one. You laid it out in the winter. You cut it, you laid it out in the winter, and the freezing and thawing and the weather itself separated the fibers that were useful from the stalk. Then you broke the stalks and took the fibers for the product that you needed. Not too bad. But turns out the Navy couldn't use it. And so it was essentially worthless if you did it that way. Not worthless, you could still use it for the other processes. But then they went to a process called water rotting. And they laid it in creeks, in different sort of troughs, wherever you could find a place to put it down in water and let it rot. Well, it produced a gas as it rotted, and it stunk like crazy. Nobody wanted to be around it. There are actually incidences, and I couldn't find out whether it was in Scott County or not, but there are actually instances where slaves revolted rather than work in water rotted hemp. But you know, they went on. It was done. Hemp production continued to be a major crop in Kentucky, in Kentucky and Scott County. By 1870, the county was producing over 1 million pounds per year of Trump. Now that's pretty good sized production if you think about it. With the introduction of steam power and the destruction of the southern cotton industry, hemp production would decline, but it would keep making these comebacks for brief periods. This is indicative of another thing that stands out in Kentucky's economy. New methods, new products, and technology would often make our money makers obsolete. We'd start up a good industry of some sort, and then along would come change, and you'll see that as I speak throughout, but that is an ongoing problem that Scott County had. You might be wondering about tobacco. Cultivation of tobacco did not begin until hemp production was virtually coming to an end. In 1880, only about 43,000 pounds of tobacco were sent to market. By 1883, Scott County farmers grew 586,000 pounds of tobacco. That's a big jump if you stop and think about it. And they cut down every tree from fence row to fence row to do it. It just, you know, they were putting everything into production that they possibly could. Most of us are old enough to know that health concerns and government regulation destroyed that crop for the most part. We were also on the edge of what have been called the tobacco wars of the late 19th and early 20th century. The American Tobacco Company and Duke Tobacco Conglomerate tried to tell Kentucky farmers who they could sell their tobacco to. So the farmers of both of those areas got together and pooled their tobacco, created cooperatives so that they could then have a little better chance at beating these huge tobacco conglomerates. It caused outright war in western Kentucky. And here, it was mostly barn burnings, destruction of plant beds, and a lot of threatening more than anything else. The cooperatives would tell farmers, you either join with us or you may get your barn burned. You may get your tobacco bed dug up. One Scott County farmer who refused to join the cooperative had his plant beds destroyed. And to make the point more clearly, a grave was dug at one end of the beds. Point taken. He joined the cooperative. But most of it was just, here was more threatening than anything else. There were other crops that Scott County sold statewide and nationally as the antebellum era progressed. Kentucky was considered a part of the national breadbasket at that time, producing large quantities of wheat and rye. It also produced great quantities of livestock, beef, sheep, and hogs. slaves were fed largely on pork. So most of the hogs went south. Beef and sheep fed northern families. So we were right in the perfect geographical position to deal with these, and that geographical position comes back occasionally as well. Scott County also raised horses and mules. Now, you know about thoroughbreds, and I'll get to them in just a minute, but horses and mules, to remind some of you, I suspect very few of you, because we're quickly getting beyond that, but horses and mules were important in a number of ways. They were the major means of transportation well into the 20th century. They carried people in carriages or on their backs. Found it really interesting. I was doing some research on a totally different area, and I found out that the Major Henry Clay McDowell sold carriage horses, matched pairs of carriage horses. And they had to be just so. It was like a kid in the 1950s talking about his car. They literally, these things were special at that time, and they were also expensive, I might add. But then you had horses for more normal things, and mules for more normal things. Hemp, tobacco, whiskey had to be transported at least to Frankfurt to get it onto the river system. They were also important to the military. The Army bought thousands of horses, and during the Civil War, each side vied for how many they could steal. They'd come up to these horses. There were thoroughbred owners that moved their stock out to Illinois to keep them away from the armies that would steal the horses. Occasionally, the somewhat dull life of a historian doing research is relieved by a gem of historical humor. Not often. But while researching the family of Henry Clay, I came across one of those gems. John Morrison Clay, Henry's youngest son, was pro-Union when the war started. He even sent Abraham Lincoln one of Henry's snuff boxes and a letter encouraging him to run the country the same way Henry would have done it, of course, were he alive and president, which seemed to evade him over time. But John Morrison raised horses, and he had slaves, and he grumbled all the time, but he told anyone who would listen, and I quote, "The Yankees steal my slaves, the rebels steal my horses, and I don't give a damn for either side." I know historians don't take much to laugh, but and you don't do it very loudly in the middle of a library. General George Armstrong Custer was riding a horse bred on the farm of John M. Clay at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We know what happened to George Armstrong Custer. We don't know what happened to the horse. To this day, nobody's figured out what happened to the horse. We often forget about the importance of mules. How many of you can remember mules plowing the field? Quite a few. Yeah, they would eventually be replaced for pulling mules and pulling other farm equipment, but tractors were expensive. And so it took a long time before that transition was made. In antebellum days, mules were bred for the southern market. They were essential to the cotton industry in northern states. They were for transportation. Scott County contributions to thoroughbred racing were much larger than you might expect. We don't have that big a thoroughbred industry in the county now. Some, but not. I think we had a runner-up in the Derby, a filly, a few years ago, that was bred here. But that's about it. Colonel Robert Saunders established the first large thoroughbred business in Scott County. He also constructed a racetrack. that drew thousands of visitors. It was somewhere, we don't know exactly where the racetrack was. The best estimate is that it crossed 25, US 25, out by Cane Run Creek as it comes across there. But we don't know for sure. You know, they just recently tore down the Robert Saunders house, which was a loss, but you know, it was not preserved, unfortunately. He also had a tavern serving Kentucky bourbon, so that the people who were there didn't get thirsty while they were watching the races. If you haven't read Gary Odell's book, Reinventing the American Thoroughbred, I would strongly advise you to do so. Scott Countyans such as Abraham Buford, James K. Duke, Willa Viley, and others were nationally prominent turfmen in the years before the Civil War. King Richards owned Bluegrass Park, which was just above the Royal Spring. If you go, it went up and out, and was over 1,000 acres where he raised horses. Tried to breed Arabian horses, with American thoroughbreds in order to make them more sturdy and to run more quickly as well. His Bluegrass Park was a gathering place for national and international horsemen. Junius Ward, who built Ward Hall, was a part of the first syndication of a horse, where a group of men get together and buy the horse and then share stud rights to it. Georgetown had its own jockey club, which is a jockey club then was to see that the rules of racing were carried out fairly to everybody involved. Well, things looked really good for Kentucky in that area, in that time. Then came the Civil War. Things changed, and changed radically. First, the Western Plains began to produce huge grain crops and cattle after the war, and the railroads carried it east, so that our industries were affected negatively. The horse industry was virtually destroyed, at least for a time. Thoroughbreds were just about done in. They were the first to be stolen by people because they wanted a fast horse to ride. It was a matter of their own well-being, I suspect, more than anything else. Thirdly, it killed the Southern market. It took the South years to restore the cotton market after the Civil War. And four, and just as importantly, it destroyed the spirit of those who had been defeated. It took years for the South, if it's ever regained its intellectual strength, its mental strength, since that war. In the years after the Civil War, about the only thing the Southern states developed was a mentality called the myth of the lost cause. James Clotter, the state historian, has written widely about this influence in Kentucky, and others have written about it as a Southern phenomenon. It certainly seems to have affected Scott County as well. The lost cause sought to explain why the South had lost the war. After all, and I'm being facetious to a point, but only to a point, after all, its manhood was more noble, more courageous, and better marksman than any Yankee. They were convinced of it. Their rural economy was clearly what God had intended. Kindly masters treated grateful slaves like members of the family. The South had given them skills and, above all, Christianity. Confederate My Confederate ancestors and most others were all heroes who, upon their return, became true Southern gentlemen like Robert E. Lee. And the damn Yankees were horrible scoundrels. Well, I never gave a speech on the Civil War that some sweet little lady didn't walk up to me after the speech and said, my relatives were slave owners, but they were good to their slaves. Folks, that's an oxymoron. That's pretty much an oxymoron. Slavery's wrong by any stretch of the imagination. Groups like the Confederate Veterans and the Daughters of the Confederacy were created to spread the myth. Around the turn of the 20th century, the Daughters of the Confederacy raised huge amounts of money to create monuments glorifying Confederate soldiers. How many such monuments stand in front of Kentucky courthouses? Next time you're out, go buy one, check it out. How many Union ones have you seen? What is it, Bill? 1 or 2 in the state of Kentucky? Do you know? Bill, can't hear me. Either 1 Union or 2 in Kentucky. 1. There's 1, and we sent 90,000 soldiers to the Union Army and about 25,000 to the Confederate Army. We're considered one of the few areas that joined the losers after a war. But, in every sense, economic or otherwise, we pretty much did. According to the myth, the rural South was a moral utopia, while the big cities of the North were dens of iniquity and crass businessmen only interested in making money. There were a lot of Southern men who would have liked to have done the same, but the South was a hard place to do that in those days. Change comes because you want it or because it is forced upon you. The myth of the lost cause seemed to place a lid over thoughts of modernization throughout the South. Now, this has been a hurried description of the lost cause. You can read whole books on it. But it gained absolute control of Southern thinking. The textbooks that I studied through high school were deeply influenced by that myth. And students that I taught as late as the 1970s had absorbed large amounts of it through school, through family, through whatever. It's hard to imagine that. But so much, only until in the 1960s, did they begin to question it again. And believe me, people who did so were not very popular in the South. Mostly it was those Northerners who looked at it. Scott County was affected by that. That does not mean, however, that all curiosity and forward thinking was lost. The carriage industry connected with horses was a part of it. It boomed in the 1880s. There were 4 carriage makers in Georgetown at the same time. That's also something that gets in the way of small towns building, is you get one business that's successful, and before you know it, you've got 3 others. And then none of them are successful because there's not a big enough market for them. The people of Sadieville dug deeply into their pockets to fund the construction of the depot there because it was a means of getting their products out to market a little quicker. But ironically, the automobile also played a significant role. In 1900, John Moore of Newtown manufactured the first automobile in Scott County. It was made from a wagon and a gasoline engine. It didn't go very far. A.C. Cook, a dentist, purchased Georgetown's first automobile in 1903. A week later, he had the city's first accident as well. Then in 1915, the Prather brothers, anybody remember Prather brothers Chevrolet? Yeah. They invented the demountable wheel. A revolutionary change. An industry changing change. Earlier, the wheels had been just a part of the axle structure, and you couldn't take them off. You had to repair them still on the automobile. Well, now you can take them off, repair them, put them back on, and be on your way. And believe me, it was essential because the roads then were made for horse-drawn wagons, not for automobiles. Unfortunately for Scott County, they sold the patent in 1917, and production did not continue here. That was bad for Scott County. It was good for them. They sold them for the current equivalent of about $500,000. And that's kind of nice. If they had stayed, that might have been the first rendition of the coming of Toyota in terms of the people it would draw in, the labor supply that it would have brought to us. There were other efforts to industrialize, but most industries failed. The Indian Oil Company left. It came in 1905. It left in 1915 because we rightly fought them over polluting the Elkhorn Creek. Frankfurt helped us fight them as well. But they also got a better offer from a place in Indiana who didn't care about their creek, and it moved there. The carriage factories obviously were replaced by the automobile. In another area of production, we just didn't see the possibilities. In the late 19th century, we produced a lot of lumber, specialty lumber, usually walnut. Huge stands of walnut trees were cut for profit. Tennessee and North Carolina used their timber to create future industries, which still function today, furniture industries, and they still exist today. We did not. Eastern Kentucky did the same thing with its lumber and then with its coal as well. Outside forces gained the financial profit from our raw materials, and it was a lack of vision that came after the Civil War. That lack of vision wasn't there before the Civil War. Not all of the country's woes were our fault. State and national economic issues managed to filter right down to us. Before the Civil War, a financial crisis occurred about once every 25 years. It stymied investment and encouraged risk aversion. After the Civil War, there were panics or recessions in 1873, 1892, and immediately after World War I. But the worst of all was the Great Depression. In October 1829, the stock market crashed and the economy just tanked. Scott County, however, had been in a state of depression throughout the 1920s. Most agriculture was. It suffered from several droughts throughout the decade and a shortage of farm labor. This doesn't sound right, but a shortage of farm labor as farm workers left to find better jobs elsewhere. And suddenly we had no one to work in the fields. The Depression was an experience that those who lived through it never forgot, nor did the generation after it. I suspect many of us can tell stories about that experience. I heard about the Depression years every time I left a room with the light on, or tried to get up from the dinner table with a crumb or a piece of homegrown broccoli still on my plate. My father's plate was as clean when he finished the meal as it was when he started it. And bless his heart, I didn't understand it as a kid growing up, but as I've gotten older, I do understand. He lived most of his life fearing that the next depression was a week away. was a week away. And he wasn't the only one. You know, they were out there, to be sure. Some have argued that agricultural communities had it better than cities because of gardens and wild game that you could hunt. The pages of the Georgetown newspaper tell a different story, and this one may surprise you. Suicides in Scott County averaged nearly one per week during the worst years of the downturn. It was just psychologically debilitating in that sense. But there was good as well as bad. That era steeled, S-T-E-E-L-E-D, the backbones of many people. The work ethic was reinforced. The will to save for a rainy day provided funds through the 1940s and 1950s that underwrote tremendous industrial growth. Many people blamed the banks and the corporations for the Depression, but they were less hostile at the same time to industries coming to town. I think I know why. They provided jobs and people wanted to eat. After the Depression and war, more lasting industries began to settle in Scott County. How many of you remember the Mallard Pencil Company? Came here in 1945. In 1948, a local company, Zarnak and Zarnak, became carbide products, which lasted a long time. 1956, Electric Parts Company. I worked there from midnight till 8 a.m. in the morning. And I said, I'm going back to graduate school. Don't want to work that kind of schedule. Hydroplastics made parts for IBM. We had several subsidiary plants to IBM. There was a stamping company that made parts on 25 just after you passed McClellan. I worked there too for a while, not from midnight till 8 a.m. 1970, Hoover Corporation came, then Johnson Service Company, and briefly Clark Equipment Company. As some industries settled here, we seem to have recovered a bit from our initial fear of industry brought in, I think caused by the lost cause mentality. We did not have a Chamber of Commerce until 1964. But once it got here, they started slowly at first encouraging the growth of encouraging bringing industry here. Now they sold it as this very pastoral setting with horses in green fields, as a nice place to live. But if it would bring the industries here, they didn't seem to mind a whole lot. A 1976 pamphlet by the Chamber of Commerce showed a new spirit, one interested in drawing new industries to the county. 2 industrial parks had been created, and the Chamber was encouraging the construction of infrastructure that could sustain industrial growth. You can sense as you look at these pamphlets the growing knowledge that our leadership have and how they're using it to try to get job-producing industries into this area. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that Toyota opened the door to the modern age. If you read the news graphic of Tuesday, a week ago, in commemorating the death of Governor Martha Lane Collins, city and state officials told the story of Toyota's impact. From a planned 2,000 to 3,000 employees, it has grown to over 8,000. It has increased our population by significant numbers. I want to show you, it's up here. You can see the population in 1980 was about 21,000. Look at how it grows. Slowly at first, and then it takes off. And it has grown, in the last 20 years, it's just grown really significantly. One of the things you can discover, by the way, by looking at population statistics I've got them all the way through from, wait a minute, that's not it. I got to go the other way. From 1800, you can see drops in economic bad times. You see growth when economic times are good. And those drops and growths are really significant in the numbers that they reveal. Housing has grown as well. I tried my best to find the number of houses that have been built in Scott County since 1988. We don't have the kind of records collection system that we need in this county. We need to be knowing better what we're doing in those kinds of areas. I couldn't find them at any rate, and I went to the Chamber of Commerce, and I went to the state tax to the tax office and to several other places without much support. And of course, we have enough chicken restaurants to supply the whole bluegrass. The coming of Toyota has produced such tremendous change that it's difficult to measure it. For the historian, the story stops here. We don't have the paper trail to measure the whole story, much less what the future holds. The only certainty is that there will be economic ups and downs. We have heard talk recently of possible recession. If it doesn't come now, it will come next year or the year after, but it will come. That's just what the history of economic development tells us. When, not if it occurs, how does it affect Scott County? How will we react? Can we as a community look to the future and plan accordingly? I think, as I look backwards, and I know there have been hiccups and there have been issues time and every once in a while, but I think generally our elected officials have done a pretty good job of meeting this tremendous growth that we've experienced over the years. I don't have the facts to show that, but just personal experience of living here, I don't think it's been terribly bad. People complain about the traffic problems, but I can live with a few traffic problems for the unemployment rate that we have as a county. People at least are employed and feeding their families. What we know from our past, again, is that change comes, whether we generate it or it comes from out of community, political, economic, or social influences. We will have to deal with it. We can only hope that we deal with it and get through it as, I won't say easily, but as efficiently as those who came before us. Thank you.